I don't want to talk about cigars. Let's talk about Richard Sherman and Stephon Gilmore because there are a couple of corners that are out there, and I feel like we talk about this most years, which is there's a depression in the market relative to coverage players. We've seen it with safeties. We've seen some really good deals come out with safeties, but it seems like there's nothing worse than being an older corner
Yeah.
that has been good before because no one wants to pay the premium price for how good you've been. And yet there is an assumption, even if you've played well recently, that the cliff is right there and you're about to, go
Yeah.
without a parachute down it. Do you think that's fair?
It's almost better. This is weird. It's almost better. Now, there have been some, I think, counters to that. Patrick Peterson getting kind of like a $10 million deal. But like when you talk about guys like Sherman, you talk about especially Gilmore. I think Gilmore's in sort of even a different tier at this point than Sherman is. Like that deal is not going to satisfy you. A $10 million per year deal is not going to be good enough. And if you're a Hall of Fame caliber player like Sherman, it's sort of similar as well. I know he didn't take that much when he did the Niners deal, but he was coming off of injuries and stuff like that and sort of negotiated his own deal. Also wanted to win, and they almost did win in 19. But it's almost better. This is weird. Like 5 years ago, right? Like Terrence Newman was like constantly getting these like 1 year, $2-3 million deals, 1 million, and still was competent. But like when you invest that little in a corner, it's sort of this perfect thing because if he plays badly, then you can sort of jettison him, or you can draft Trey Waynes and no one's going to care. And you saw that recently, right? Where you saw Bashaud Breeland go to Minnesota for a relatively modest deal. You see, Malcolm Butler go to Arizona for a better deal, I believe, than Patrick Peterson went to Minnesota for. It's almost better to be a corner who's like in that like second or third tier, because you'll get a contract every time, and teams are like more willing, knowing how sort of streaky cornerback play is, to pay a guy like that and have like a cornerback room full of guys than to pay an elite player. Because like we've seen with Trumaine Johnson, we've seen Nnamdi Asomugha, we've seen like a number of players at that corner position where people thought they were paying for brilliance and they ended up getting like not that. And it can really hurt you because again, like defensive back play is more of a collective thing than it is an individual thing.
Yeah, that's another good point, right? You see, am I spending a certain percentage of my cap on one player when I don't have a super deep unit? Now, the Patriots, interestingly, have done that. I also think there's this weird, and I don't know if this exists within the league. I think there's probably a little bit of it underneath there, which is if the Patriots are willing to trade me a player, do they know something I don't know? It's like
Yeah.
more so that way than there might be with any other team. And so you look at Stephon Gilmore, who, by the way, is 31 and has played brilliantly, but is heading into the last year of his deal. And so we'll certainly want a new deal. And if he plays well again, he was at 13 APY in his last deal, over the course of, I think it was 5 seasons. That's a lot, right? That's a lot to pay for a guy if you don't have that kind of stable. I'm curious, do you think, I don't know if it would cost a second or a third round pick or something like that at this point, would you make the move? And if so, which team would you say is in a position where they could actually benefit from going and getting Stephon Gilmore?
Yeah, by the way, Belichick, kind of an example of just valuing coverage altogether, right? Like we've seen Jason McCourty on small deals. We've seen with Lee Bowden. We've seen, I'm trying to think of the other, Brandon Browner. And then he's also splashed on the Revises, the Ty Laws, and the Gilmore. So it's really interesting, his approach. I think that Belichick makes an exception. And I heard this on Mina Khan's show. I think Greg Rosenthal was one to say that is like the one position that Belichick makes exceptions, which is like shutdown corner, because he sort of scaffolds his entire defense around that. I think they end up, sort of getting it done, especially because the Patriots are sort of in win now mode. Like if you've already spent all this money on all these players, what's another 4 million like in a particular season for Gilmore, given how good he can be? But if I were a team that was sort of like on the cusp and I had cap space, like I would certainly throw a second round pick at Gilmore. The issue is going to be, and we've seen this with Jamal Adams, and you're going to see it with Orlando Brown. If you trade for a veteran player, you better have that contract extension or reworking ready, because like if a guy's unhappy with a deal where he currently is, he's not going to be happy where he goes, right? Like that is, it doesn't get much easier after the trade unless you have a contract. And a lot of teams I don't think have like the cash. Like some teams have cap, but I don't think they have the cash to absorb that big of a deal. And the teams that do, like, I'm trying to think of like who would. They've already made big plays in free agency right now, and even though they have a ton of cap space, like they've pushed things around so that almost every team right now is spending above and beyond the 180 million that they were allocated.
Yeah, you also think about teams in win now mode, and you go, okay, well, a lot of them have also, to get in that mode, given up a ton of draft capital. So you're looking at a team that maybe wants to play around a little bit more with winning this year, and values, say, okay, the second round pick, kind of the way that the Rams think about it. And that's why, I don't know, if he's truly on the trading block, and personally, if I'm the Patriots, all the moves that you've made in free agency are, as you said, win now moves. So trading him, to me, does not make sense, because you're going to get a second round pick down the road. It'll be 3 years before that player contributes. And you've made all these investments in players that are not going to be helping you really in 3 years, right? If we're being realistic, and people get mad about that, but it's like, no, like, look at how that works. And so if you go down the list, you're like, okay, where are some of these win now teams, and do they need coverage players? And then do they have cap? Like, the list gets really, really small really quickly. The one place that I thought was really interesting, but there's no way they're going to trade him here, would be the Miami Dolphins, who obviously still have Byron Jones and Xavier Howard. But the Brian Flores connection there. I want to say
Xavier Howard is also unhappy and holding out.
Yes, exactly. Like it doesn't make sense, for them to actually go do that. So I think the best place for Gilmore certainly is in New England. I think it's the best place for him, and I think it's the best place for the Patriots, from the Patriots perspective. I will give you one more. The
Patriots aren't good enough to win now while trading a corner like Gilmore. Like they're not a, like the Packers could trade Jair Alexander and still probably be okay if Rodgers is playing. The Ravens could maybe trade like Marlon Humphrey and still be good. I don't think the Rams could trade Jalen Ramsey and still be good. But like if your team is not one that has like an elite quarterback and a great offense, then you shouldn't be trading like that team. The path for the Patriots to be good and to win is extremely narrow. It's to have a good defense reminiscent of 2019 or earlier, and have an offense that is appreciably better than last year. But like, there's no universe where Cam Newton's an MVP this year. Like there isn't, and you're otherwise banking on a middle of the first round quarterback who I think we all like, but is not like that. Again, that's not a path. And so like trading Gilmore from a defense that was extremely creaky relative to expectations a season ago is not smart if you're trying to win now. If they're trying to rebuild, then that's fine. And I get that, but I don't think that that's really what they want to do.
I'll give you a couple more teams here that I think could make some sense. Now, this number would be a little tricky. The Titans, I believe, I'm looking at overcap.com right now, I think they have $7 million in cap space. They desperately need coverage players, desperately, and especially after drafting Caleb Farley, who I would not expect. Do not expect that guy to be cornerback number one, like just immediately out of the gate. It is a tough adjustment there. Going and linking up with Vrabel, I think would be a great place for him. A couple more that are interesting, teams that do have cap space. Your Chargers, they have a decent amount of cap space. Brandon Staley comes in, and Brandon Staley loves to have corners, as we saw with the Rams, where they are chess pieces and he can move them around. And I think that would be one of them. Certainly, they're not, I don't know, technically in win now mode, but they have a rookie quarterback, where it makes perfect sense to come in and bring some of these players who you might have to pay a little bit of money to. So those are the two that really come to mind for me in terms of it makes sense and they have that space. You could talk about the Niners, and we'll talk about Sherman here. Like the Niners are another team that has, cornerback need. Certainly, I think everyone in the league has cornerback need. But based on where they're going to be spending their money, right, it doesn't make sense totally down the road going with an older an older corner.
Yeah, and the Chargers drafted Asante Samuel Jr. in round 2 to replace Casey Hayward, more or less. That was probably a good move. They traded Desmond King last year. They're not as thick in the secondary as they used to be. Obviously, the Jets and Jaguars have a ton of space. The Browns and Broncos and Browns have done yeoman's work on their secondary this offseason. So it really goes down to that. Jaguars not really in win now mode. Jets aren't either, although and the Jets are sort of a rival of New England for whatever that's worth. So yeah, the margins are thin there at the cornerback position as far as like suitors, and that gets back to the whole Julio thing. Like you talk about the Titans, like the Titans traded an asset that they probably would have to trade for Gilmore for Julio Jones, so like that of course makes things more complicated. And again, it's more than just the draft pick, right? It's more than just the compensation on draft day for these guys. It's the dollars and cents, and those are of course difficult to spin, especially when you have as much dead money as a team like the Jets or the Titans do.
And I think it's interesting. You look at Gilmore, his performance year to year, and from a PFF grade standpoint, it was not his finest moment last year in coverage. And that, to me, I'm not actually that worried about it. We know coverage is so unstable that I am going to take that as a data point amongst a lot of data points. I'm not going to look at it as the start of necessarily a downward trajectory. Where the year before he had allowed 1 touchdown, had 6 interceptions, 14 forced incompletions. That's a remarkable ratio, right? And this past season, just 1 interception, 1 forced incompletion. 3 forced incompletions. Now, albeit on some fewer snaps, but the numbers were not as good last year. Allowed almost 10% higher completion rate into his coverage. But there were a lot of issues with that Patriots defense where they were not as strong all around. And so that would be something that I would definitely take into consideration here. I still think he's capable of, top 5 to top 10 cornerback play. It just may be that you don't get it for as long.